Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation for today, Cloud Deployment Models, Getting Your Data Off the Ground and into the Cloud. This presentation will focus on some of the strategies for architecting and deploying data to the cloud. This webinar is also the third in Neovera's Cloud Deployment Model series, and if you'd like to view the previous webinars, they are currently housed in the resource section on Neovera's website. So our presenter for today is Armin Rolls. He's Neovera's Senior Oracle Database Architect. Armin has over 25 years experience working with Oracle products, as well as being an instructor for Oracle DB training and a presenter at Oracle World. So one quick housekeeping item before we do start. Along the way, if you do happen to have any questions, please place them in the questions section. We'll do our best to answer all of these at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I will now hand this presentation over to our presenter. Armin, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sharp. So what is this webinar really about? Like was previously mentioned, we've done quite a few cloud deployment models. I'm going to focus mainly on the data side of it, although I will touch on some high level and maybe some of the broader aspects of cloud deployment models in general, how you might leverage the models, the different types of models, and some of the case studies around examples around some cloud deployment models that we've assisted other clients with. So as a general overview, when we're dealing with clients that want to do a cloud migration, some of the things that we hear about their hesitancy might be driven by things like security. Maybe it might not work with all my applications. I don't really control things. I'm not sure of the performance. And then definitely some of the cost or return on your investments with going to that. So hopefully with this presentation, you'll get an idea of some of the strategies around deploying your data to the cloud. And as I previously mentioned, we'll highlight some things about a case study. I'll take an example of one and show you how we went through the phases of deployments and some of the takeaways from that if you're contemplating doing a migration to the cloud. And these things at the very end of takeaways will be things related to that case study that was on Oracle. So they'll be very Oracle specific in that regard. Not to say that we do the migrations for AWS, we do it for Microsoft. So, I drive the Oracle side of things, and that's kind of like I'll target some of those today. There's some interesting quotes that I found I thought are very typical or definitely represent cloud migrations. I really like the one from the VMware. It's not about how you do the computing, or it's about how you do the computing, not where you do it. So obviously you have a bunch of choices between cloud providers, and like which one do you pick, and how do I actually decide what model or approach I'm going to take with regards to that. So the key areas for migration success, this kind of represents a high level, in order to ensure your migration is successful, you need to make sure everyone in your organization understands what was the original drivers, motivations behind wanting to go to the cloud. It could be things like, end-of-life support, or your current technologies are becoming obsolete, or you want to get newer technologies. Your current data center contract might be coming up for renewal, and you want to look at, whether or not you should migrate out of on-prem or a private cloud data center to public cloud. It could also be things like regulatory compliance. So you may be challenged with new regulatory requirements that you not really sure you can meet, or the cost of meeting it on-prem would not be a good return on your investment. So to make sure, you want to make sure everyone can answer the question, why are we moving to the cloud? This basically involves aligning your people, your processes, your technology around all those motivations to achieve whatever your business goal is. So if there are any inadequate or misaligned motivations, you would end up facing a lot of resistance in the organization, and that you want to try to avoid up front. Most or one of the motivations might be a cost savings, but you have to really know how you're going to do that migration process so that you don't end up costing more money than what your on-prem is. So you want to make sure with the proper data governance, which you see cloud and data governance framework at the bottom, you can kind of put in some metrics and measures and notifications and things like that that keep you within your budget. Another thing to keep in mind is the security is probably the single biggest thing I would say that you need to make sure that you're aligned on, that you're enforcing that security and whatever your compliance standards are. It's not an out-of-the-box experience across public cloud providers. So you need to know where your responsibilities lie in fitting into whatever security posture that you are trying to achieve. And then the last thing, so if you have that governance framework, that's what's going to be able to allow you to rationalize what your workloads are, which workloads and applications should be slated for that cloud adoption. So this is it's a lot on this slide, but this is basically a logical view of whatever what your reference architecture could look like, or there may have bits and pieces of this. So this one is representative for either hybrid or multi-cloud framework. I'll give you a few seconds to digest that. But if you look at the picture on the right, looking at the center, the light blue, so that's organized from bottom to top. Basically, this represents a OSI 7-layer model. Most of all of this you'll see from the cloud providers that they provide. So from the physical layer all the way up through the cloud provider to wherever your end users are at. This is the bits and pieces of it where you would ultimately end up mapping some of your current assets to. And we'll talk about that more in detail. So one of the other things I want to point out on here is although it looks like a lot, there's probably a lot of this you're already doing at some level or another. If you've ever had to go through a SOC audit or user audit, you have the security management piece and being able to prove that your administration, your authentication, authorization, all of that is being adhered to. So if you have some strict regulatory compliance rules, PCI, things like that, you would already be doing these. And it's not a big leap of faith to be able to do this in the cloud as well. And also about budgeting, so controlling costs, things like that, that comes into the governance side and the management side. If you take maybe an example might be on site, you would create VMs and you go to the cloud. Now users are more empowered to do that themselves. You don't want to get in a situation where you have your infrastructure and all that growing without being able to track who creates it, who is actually authorizing these, how long what's its lifespan, does it get decommissioned properly, and then basically all the security and IT services wrap around all of that. And one of the bullet points you'll see off to the left, we mentioned a lot, is the automation. So when you take all this from on-prem, you go to the cloud, automation with the use of the governance capabilities, being able to budget and things like that, automation is going to be a key to being able to have a higher ROI on this. You don't want to move to the cloud and then be doing everything manual. There's a lot of frameworks already in place to support this with the different cloud providers. You want to take advantage of all the automation processes as possible. And I'll actually, in the case study, I'll talk about how we made use of that for budgeting and for cost purposes, all automated. So we talk about the different cloud deployment models, skipping an on-prem to a private cloud, which is not represented here really, but the primary ones are you're on-prem and you need to pick a cloud provider, or you're going to a cloud provider, or you're going to multiple cloud providers. So that's, all your software technology is located in your own data center. Now, when you start your cloud deployment model, you're going to be looking at what do I take advantage of in the cloud from what provider? And you'll recognize some of these terms here represented in the cloud provider, SaaS, IaaS, PaaS. So you got your software-based software as a service. You could have pieces of it that are going to be your infrastructure as a service. So those are going to be the things you use to build your compute resources or storage, networking, all of that. What you do today on-prem all moves into or could be supplemented, complemented by the cloud provider. And then a platform as a service. So this is where the provider's already given you everything to develop and deploy environment with their built-in software and all of their automated pieces of it, but you're not actually maintaining the software anymore. So when we get to the process where we're going to map things and figure out like what are we going to take advantage of, there could be cases where whatever you have on site is going to just move over, and that might be infrastructure as a service. You may have applications that are also represented in the cloud provided by the cloud provider. So those would be a case where you may decide, okay, we're just going to drop the on-prem, migrate everything over to the platform as a service. And then software as a service as well. So same thing, you could actually have that on-prem. You may decide to migrate that to their version of that software, or actually refactor what you have on-prem to what the cloud provider is providing. It could be for cost purposes, could be for functionality, business continuity, things like that. So when we talk about the different, either a single cloud provider or you pick a multi-cloud provider, you need to kind of know where your regions are going to be when you set up your tenants or whatever you're going to create in the provider itself. So this is kind of like a map of just the commercial regions. Doesn't take into account if you're a government entity and where their government sites are. In fact, some of them don't even publish where their government sites, data centers are, their regions. They're undisclosed. So physically mapping them out, it's like US East, US West, those kind of things, Central. These are where AWS is. This is where Oracle's major regions are. And of course, all the providers are constantly trying to spin up more. So at this point in time, this is kind of the map. And you can see Microsoft seems to have a lot of them. This also comes important when you're doing DR. So if you decide that you're going to do multi-regions within a provider, this is kind of where you would be picking your DR. So you may pick Ashburn, which is the Virginia for Oracle, but your DR being Phoenix or San Jose or California. So when you do your DR, you have some sort of idea of where that region's at. One of the key things to understand when you're doing a cloud migration or deployment is within the cloud provider, where does your responsibility lie versus where the responsibility of the cloud provider is, or what they manage, I should say. So you need to have a good understanding of where these are for your deployment so that you know upfront which people, processes, and things are going to be affected by responsibility of that management. And it's most important, as I mentioned earlier, is you need to know what you're responsible for your security threat model. Quite often, I mean, most security threats, as just this week, T-Mobile, millions of records exposed, that was on-prem, but the ones that are far less, you see that in the cloud provider model, but the ones that do happen in the cloud provider model is generally because they didn't have an understanding of where the security was that you are responsible for. And like the biggest one, I think most people might be familiar with, AWS. Somebody misconfigured their object storage or their storage piece of it permissions, they put it in a public domain instead of a private network, subnet. So things like knowing where you need to take control is going to be important. This is actually a chart from the NSA, and they have a pretty good white paper on cybersecurity. And this is what the NSA publishes for all of NSA's cloud responsibility, where they lie. All right, so you decided you're going to do a migration. How do you even go about doing it? To be successful, you have to kind of go, and this is over experience with the cloud migrations we've done, whether it be AWS, Oracle, or Azure. There has to be these phases that we feel like, based on our experience, mitigate the risk of moving to the cloud, mitigate the cost of moving to the cloud. So you want to kind of go through this discovery phase. Very critical to do the very first part. This is where you're going to define all your on-prem assets, everything that you plan on migrating to the cloud. Now, some things you wouldn't necessarily have to put in that discovery if you're not going to move it at all. Example is, a lot of financial institutions and some healthcare actually still have mainframes. Those aren't moving to the cloud. But it could be part of a discovery if you want to get out of that business on-prem and you want to migrate that to some cloud version, like move the databases to something, move the applications to something else. Then you should have all of that in your discovery. You want to have in that discovery everything you can about that asset, like the CPUs, how many cores it has, what's the amount of memory, what's the amount of storage it uses, what version of this software or hardware or anything like that is associated with that asset. That's going to help you do the mapping piece later. Then you kind of go to once you've gotten all that, you kind of go to a pre-migration phase. This is where you're going to walk through what the requirements are for anything that is going to move and whether or not it requires you to, and we'll talk about more of this, but whether it requires you to refactor it or rebuild it or replace it, things like that. You walk through all those requirements and you're going to basically build a mapping between what you've discovered in your assets to where they're going to end up in the cloud and on what cloud provider in a multi-cloud provider scenario. And then you actually go through the migration. So by this point, you should already have a good set of business processes in place, allows you to actually take each of those assets, make the move to the cloud. You're going to be kind of resolving the issues of things that are dependent on other things. This is another thing in the discovery phase I would mention, that you would actually, for an asset, it could be software, it could be platform or something else, but you're actually going to draw an association to other related assets, and those assets could be external in addition to being internal. So you need to know which ones are coupled. So when you do your migration, you can't just move a database if there's external dependencies on getting data into the database. Some of those things all need to move together. So that part of the migration, you'll kind of get that together as part of going through the discovery and pre-migration. And then of course the post-migration. So once you get to the cloud, what then? What do I need to do then? There's lots of operational things that you would have to address. There could be changes in business processes. There could be new or supplemented security requirements moving there. And all of this, I mentioned this as a proof of concept. So the proof of concept, and every client we've done this with, they've always done a proof of concept. I don't think anybody wants to just make the decision to go without showing proof. The proof of concept kind of touches on every single one of these. You're going to go through these phases. You could be going through this phase in conjunction with the broader plan moving, or it could just be, I'm going to go through these particular phases just for a POC and then come back and visit it for the entire organization. So it could be sequential, it could be overlapping, but it's important to kind of do that proof of concept all the way through. And we'll talk about like how do I do a proof of concept, or what do I pick for doing a proof of concept as well. So if you go through all those phases, those 4 phases, you document all what you need to document. These are some of the artifacts that we find that are most common outputs of that process. So you document your stakeholders. You need to know who's going to be responsible for what. You need to know who needs to know what's actually migrating. So it's quite common that involves multiple stakeholders. You have IT departments, you have business users, it could be development staff, onshore or offshore. All of those kind of stakeholders need to kind of know what's going on and what's going to be our outcome. I talked about this as part of the discovery phase. You should build an asset catalog. You'll have a full list. You should have a list of what you're going to migrate, and then you're going to actually map that particular asset to its corresponding or its equal in the cloud. It could be something entirely different. Like I said, you may be replacing something, or it could be something as simple as I'm lifting and shifting, and this is where it's going to go when it hits the cloud. Also very important, based on all the migrations we've done, it's interesting that as you move through these proof of concepts or build a checklist of what's ready and what's not ready, we typically find that there's third-party COTS programs. They work great on-prem. When you get to the cloud, there's some sort of nuance about it. And it could be things like they're not even certified in the cloud, or yes, and the last one I did, there was actually 3 COTS programs that didn't even know that they could go in the cloud. They wasn't sure that it could go in the cloud. They thought it could, and we kind of just like helped them prove that it could with the following changes. So you should be able to check off out of your asset catalog which one of these things can go right now versus there may be a lot of little nuances to getting it to work. And then dependency mapping. Like I said, you could have, especially in a multi-cloud scenario, you could have source databases generating data from Microsoft, the Azure side, SQL Server, but it needs to be fed into a warehouse that's sitting on the Oracle side. So you're not going to just pick up an Oracle database and drop it over there and then that's it. You have to have all of these dependencies mapped. Could be external to another cloud provider, could be a third-party software vendor somewhere, or it could be some sort of internal process. All of that you kind of need to map the dependencies. And that comes from your asset catalog, it being ready, and here's all the dependencies associated with it. Once you have that, there's also the migration prioritization, where you're going to forecast a timeline. You're going to decide on what are the iterations are going to be. So in the case of like a POC, you're going to pick something to go to be a part of the POC, how long that's going to run for, and then what is the timeline once you've completed and proved that. What would be the timeline to get my entire organization over? This could be, that timeline could be like where you might spend a lot of time trying to figure out, based on your own internal resources, whether or not you have somebody like Neovera provide that timeline and assist you with the migration. So you kind of got to go through all of that. And again, security, you're never going to hear me be lax on the security part of it. You need to know who, what, when, how. Everything is going to communicate with something in the cloud, and then under what authentication and authorization protocols. You're going to have security already built into your on-prem, but when you go to the cloud, what additional things do you need to supplement the cloud with? Are you going to integrate with your Microsoft Active Directory? Are you going to be able to accommodate additional protocols for API keys and things like applications being able to connect using encrypted wallets and things like that? So all of that you need to know what are the requirements. At least it's easy enough, it should be easy enough for you to document that on-prem, but there could be some things or changes to that, or an entire replacement of some things when it comes to the security side. So Unfortunately, a lot of people that have Oracle on-prem, they may encrypt the data. Rarely do I see those companies encrypting the connections. So the database may be encrypted, the data may be encrypted, but the communication is not. They're still using regular TCP instead of TCPS. And what happens is now you're going to the cloud. All of that requires you to have encrypted communication. So now you need to be able to map those applications and their ability to be able to do that encryption. And then, as any C-level is going to tell you, or higher level management, how much is this going to cost? How much am I going to save? Now, I'll mention on the POC, when you do a POC, don't rely on your trial period of a POC to determine what your overall budget or cost savings or actual cost period would be. Those trial periods for most of the providers have a much lower burn rate than it would be when you actually get there. So you really need to kind of do some estimate up front based on the pricing model, whatever pricing model of the provider that you pick. You can kind of forecast that out once you know all your assets. So you should be able to come up with a really good rough estimate. You should be able to meet your target at least. And I'll show you some of the things that'll help you determine whether or not you're meeting your target or estimates on that in the later slides. And then, of course, what processes are going to be affected and how do they map to the new architecture? So picking up a database and moving it to the cloud, picking up application, moving it to the cloud, you may have done things a certain way on-prem because you had the ability, you had access to the server, the underlying OS, things like that. That's not going to map necessarily, or may not map when you get to the cloud. So now you need to look at the business processes and say, okay, data flow, it's a little different. I used to put it on a file share in on-prem and I would copy it up to this location. Well, you may not have the exact representation of that in the cloud. There'll be something different. It could be object storage or S3 buckets, things like that on the AWS side. You need to know, okay, now how do I change, what parts of my business process are going to have to change to be able to migrate, to do the data integration between applications, different databases, how's that data going to flow? And then you can have things that people kind of forget. In production, typically organizations will have a development, a UAT or QA testing environment, and those processes are all internal to recreate those different environments. So you may have a database refresh, something a DBA may do. You may have automated processes or whatever, and you do those as you need. Well, when you get to the cloud, that process isn't going to work if you did it with database scripts or shell scripts on the server or things like that, batch files that you may not have access to anymore, depending on what database you pick. So you kind of need to think about those, outliers to what you do in your business to support your different business units or different teams. So like I said, all of these are artifacts that, this is what we've come to find comes out of our process of doing those phases that we give the organization or we help them create so that they have a good understanding going into the final parts of the migration. So you've got all the artifacts and now you need to do, or at least part of one of the artifacts is your mappings. And as part of that mapping, not everything's going to be a one-to-one. If you're just lifting and shifting maybe a VM and you're just lift and shift it to the cloud, yeah, that's just basically I'm rehosting it. So not a whole lot of work there that you may need to do. Maybe some networking pieces might need to be done, authorization stuff. But for the most part, you're not really making use of anything on the cloud side that's new technology or whatever. You could also you need to define when you do these mappings, is this something I'm going to refactor? Things like where my data is going to be placed at, what are the pipelines for data integration and movement, authentication. You maybe have to integrate your Microsoft AD into this new cloud infrastructure. You maybe decide that you're going to add additional authentication protocols. or you're going to re-architect it. There will be pieces, obviously, when you go to the cloud. You're going to have new pieces of a network. You're going to have new gateways. You're going to have to create subnets, all of these things, along with maybe even you decide to do a database consolidation as part of re-architecting what you have on-prem to where you're going in the cloud, or whatever cloud provider service you're going to. Some things could be rebuild. So you have new VPNs, you can rebuild, recreate new VPNs. You may be only needing an IPsec type tunnel VPN, or you may say, okay, my data transfer needs exceed that, and now I need more fast connect from the Oracle side, or you could be looking at the direct connect or express routes between different multi-providers. So you're kind of going to be rebuilding that. In some cases, also storage and databases. So you're not going to be utilizing your on-prem, storage, NAS, things like that. How does that going to be rebuilt in a cloud provider service model? And also databases, you could be doing that as well. Or you could say, okay, this is something I have on site, but it's outdated. I'm multi-versions behind. I don't want to move that. I would rather make use of either the newer version of what that platform offers already, in which case you're going to be replacing these. You're going to be replacing your disaster recovery strategy probably. It's not going to be on-prem. You're going to tape, and the tape is going to Iron Mountain, and I'm also sending it from Ashburn to Chicago. Those things probably be replaced entirely. I'll talk a little bit more about the disaster recovery. It's very interesting about how a lot of organizations will try to over-architect that piece. But when you go to the cloud, I think there's a lot more simpler and cost-effective methods for that. And then database, you may decide to replace it altogether. That's where you may be going from something on-prem, could be MariaDB or something, and you decide to go to MySQL in Oracle. So you're replacing the database. So all of these, the 5 R's we call it, these are things that you should have an idea of where what kind of approach you're going to take with regards to that asset on-prem and where it's going in the cloud. So let me start with a case study. I'm going to actually walk through how we did some of the same phases with this particular client. And this is just a piece of it. It's not the entire thing, but we did our asset inventory. Client has multi-terabyte production database. It's on 11G. Of course, that's in database terms, that's like really outdated now. They also had a bunch of they had a clone copy of the warehouse for UAT and reporting. So they didn't want to impact their data warehouse activity, ETL processing and things like that, with users doing some reporting and doing some user acceptance. So they had a whole separate environment just for that they would refresh from production. Like I said, multi-terabyte refresh whenever they needed to do it. They also had 3 copies of the warehouse for development. These were also refreshed from production. So you can see we have like 4 copies already of multi-terabyte data warehouse. They had 3 copies because it kind of fit into their development cycles. So they may actually be developing on one thing, and then while that's finishing up, they started another. And this would be really common probably for development shops that have both onshore and offshore. So there's a copy for an offshore maybe that they're working on during the night, and they would cycle these three development warehouses out as they needed. They also did all their reporting software on OBIE, the Oracle's Business Intelligence Enterprise Edition on site. I believe at the time that was either current or maybe only one version behind, so they were pretty current with that. They had 2 ETL servers, so running Pentaho ETLs processes on production, and then they also had the same exact corresponding thing for development. And then they would just point those ETL to whichever of those 3 development servers they wanted to test something out on. They also had from on-prem, they already had a footprint in AWS. So they already had SQL Server. They had a bunch of S3 buckets set up. They had lots of data being stored in those S3 buckets that were part of SQL Server processing that would generate some intermediate results. And then they would ingest that into Oracle for their data warehouse, more of a fact dimension model. But they had that footprint already. They already had, the communications that they needed from on-prem to AWS to support that. And some of that was because they had made acquisitions. They had acquired other companies or bits and pieces of companies, and those companies had SQL Server, so they kind of inherited some of that. And then they had a lot of file shares that were attached to their on-prem database server. This company generated tens of thousands of, I'll say statements, XML, basically XML files that were being used for statements and such. Those were all being stored locally, generated locally from the database on the database server. Then those files would then get transferred up to S3 buckets on an AWS side, and there would be some reconciliation processes that would run from that side. So that's kind of like what we took as the POC piece of it. And every one of these was part of the POC basically. So as part of the phases that I mentioned earlier, we started doing the mapping part of it. We have all our assets now. Now we start doing the mapping. So now the multi-terabyte data warehouse is going to Autonomous Data Warehouse 19C, their latest version at that time on Oracle's cloud. The clone copies of the UAT and reporting, this was interesting because they thought they were still going to need that. But once we got to the Autonomous Data Warehouse side, and as we were going through the POC, we noticed that we could put a load on the Autonomous Data Warehouse. In addition to all the ETL stuff, we could consume the UAT and the reporting needs all with that same database. They weren't impacting each other. So in this case, we actually were able to eliminate an additional production database or eliminate that UAT reporting. And utilize the current production. We sized it through the POC. We played with the different sizing pieces of it to where we knew what the optimal size was to accommodate that additional reporting. And then the 3 clone copies of the warehouse that they generally had, we reduced that down to 1. I think they may have used 2 at one point, but most of the time they were now able to use just 1. And the reason being is because they were able now to refresh on demand from the production warehouse we had created some Oracle API scripts for them. And so now whenever a developer needed to do something, they would actually be able to kick off a script, and within a few minutes, they'd have a whole copy of production. So the fact that we didn't have to go through a huge lag time between getting the on-prem, the same thing we did on-prem with refreshes, the cloud provided it so much more faster and so much more easier and really on demand. Didn't require DBA or anybody else to get involved other than a developer or the business making a decision that I need a copy for this particular reason. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Reporting software. So as I said, they had OBIE. We were able to migrate that entire software to the Oracle Analytics Cloud. So everything that they were using to do BI reporting, executive dashboards, all those things were now migrated over to the Oracle Analytics Cloud. And that was actually a fairly easy migration, basically a repository export and import. So I'd say that was definitely a win on their side because they picked up a lot more capabilities on the analytic cloud side than they had with the OBIE, not to mention management of OBIE, patching and all that stuff. And then there are 2 ETL servers. This is one where I talked about the 5 Rs. This was just rebuilt. We basically looked at what was in production and development, very simple Pentaho infrastructure around that, and a repository, replicated that in AWS, and just basically replaced it. One thing I'll make note on that is, okay, well, why did you put the ETL servers in AWS versus cloud? I think our general recommendation was that that should be in Oracle, not in AWS. The client went with AWS because they had already had a footprint there. They were a little bit more comfortable with the server piece, the compute piece of it in AWS. And so they put it there. In retrospect, now they're seeing that the costs are so much greater in the AWS side that they've started scaling down their ETL servers to save money. So I think that this would have been a case where it would have been better if that would have been probably on the Oracle side. And I'll talk about, or maybe I'll just go ahead and address it now, the reasons why you might pick to put something in one provider versus the other. Obviously, there's cost associated. You want to reduce the cost. You want to maintain performance and functionality. So given performance and functionality is the same, why not pick the cheapest thing, or what's going to be the most cost-effective thing? Originally, this was, and you have to take into account bandwidth. So putting it in AWS means you got to go outbound. And where are the charges highest for outbound? Is it Oracle? Is Oracle's inbound more expensive than AWS is outbound? And in the case, AWS is definitely more expensive. Data integration with AWS services. So like I said, they had on-prem to SQL Server and S3 buckets. We were able to reconfigure networking. We actually created a fast connect between Oracle and AWS. So direct communications, pretty much fastest communication between those two providers. You have varying levels of that fastness, I should say, like 1 gig, 10 gig, things like that. So basically based on whatever your bandwidth needs are is how you might configure that part of it. But it was very simple, very easy to configure. And now what Oracle was doing on-prem to file shares is now going to the S3 buckets on AWS side. So even though there's multi-cloud scenarios that you might factor in, it's not as difficult as you might think to get those to communicate. And again, I mentioned the file shares. So we basically replaced all the database directories that they were using on-prem and used the database directories and Oracle Object Storage, and just created a procedure that allowed them to on demand say, okay, copy all these XML files. And like I said, sometimes they were over like 10,000 of these files. They were small, but there was a lot of them. Automatically copy them from Oracle to S3 buckets. So that was kind of our mapping. We identified everything, we mapped it, and then there were some additional design architecture tasks we did as part of that. So you have to create the VPN connectivity from on-prem to the Oracle cloud. Like I said, we used the Fast Connect as part of our migration. I mentioned it's a multi-terabyte database. So you're sending multi-terabytes of data potentially from on-prem to the cloud as part of your initial load or testing your POC or whatever. The Fast Connect could take that from 3 days down to hours or less than a day. So we utilized that for that short period of time. IPsec was sufficient for everything after migration. So from on-prem to Oracle, Fast Connect to get the data there and to do what we needed to do to test, but ongoing from there, they only needed IPsec. So eliminate a cost right there. IPsec is free, so that was a no-brainer. We also designed and created compartments, their subnets, their gateways, configured their security lists, network security groups. We also helped set up the Oracle Cloud Identity Service piece of it, so the users and the roles. They actually implemented multi-factor authentication, so there was an Okta piece to this. So authentication normal through syncing with Active Directory, Microsoft's Active Directory, and then supplement that with a multi-factor authentication through Okta. And then help them design, create, and lay out all their object storage. So migrating, how did we actually, or what are some of the key things we did as part of the POC in migration? So we did an actual export import. It was, like I said, multi-terabytes of data. So, there was some time there that it took to get the data all out of the production database and then all imported into the Oracle AD Autonomous Data Warehouse side. I will say that the import took half the time it took to export, which was surprising. We took advantage of the POC timeframe. Remember I said that the POC during that timeframe, the budget, your burn rate is so much smaller, so you can't really get a good representation of cost for that. You may get $3,000 to do a POC and use a database for a week, and it only costed you a couple $100. That's not going to be representative of when you go to the cloud for real. But take advantage of that for your POC, scale up your instances to support the maximum amount of resources you can use at any given time. And that's what we did. We scaled really high. Import was really fast. We actually went through multiple iterations of that since it was so fast at one point. We created all the ETL servers in AWS, migrated their OBIE, as I mentioned. And then we were able to run their ETL processes in tandem with on-prem. So the nature of their business was ETLs run almost every day, but for the most part, they were running big batch ETL jobs that produce things for reporting for weekly, some of it monthly or quarterly. So we was actually able to get the databases. They were pretty much in sync between the POC environment and on-prem, run ETL on-prem, run ETL in the cloud environment, and be able to, like, okay, let's prove that this is better, faster, more reliable, things like that. So we were able to do that all at the same time. And then we were able, as part of that, it allowed us to compare all the jobs in the BI report. So, the first thing people are going to say is, on-prem, here's what I get for a report. I better get the same report when I run that in the cloud. We were able to do that with them, to be able to do that in tandem. So maximize everything about the QA portion of the POC. Go live. We actually did an export import when we decided, okay, everything works great, let's do this for real. We exported and we imported, got the database consistent with the initial load. We actually used the Oracle Golden Gate service. So they didn't have Golden Gate on-prem before. We all know that's very expensive on-prem. But we were able to take advantage of almost basically a free service for that time period, set up the replication between source and target. Everything going on, those ETL jobs we're doing in production, was in the cloud environment within seconds. I don't think we ever exceeded a few seconds lag time. And so what that allows us to do is, once it also allowed us to compare reports real time now between on-prem and production, or on-prem and the cloud prior to the cutover. And then it also allowed us to cut it over in less than an hour. I literally turned one off and turned the other one on, and we were done. We had in advance to that, while we were in this running in replicated real-time mode for a week or so, or a couple weeks, I think we ran it. We refreshed the analytic cloud from on-prem, the repository, so that was all in sync. And then most of that 1 hour cutover was because we had to run some updates to the database. Once we cut off on-prem and went to the cloud, and I'll mention some of these things to consider, but we had to run an update against all the sysdate fields in the database, basically updating them with their UTC equivalent. And that's one of the takeaways you'll see in a moment. Post-migration, we created all the startup shutdown scripts for them, so that now databases in the dev environment could automatically be shut down during off hours. This is one of the methods you could use to save costs. So it's not being used, not used on a weekend, not used after 8 p.m. at night, and doesn't get used till 8 a.m. weekdays. Those databases are down. They're not running up any cost other than their storage piece. The most useful piece of it was automating the scaling of the databases. So if you can imagine multi-terabyte database, You might run some ETL on that, and then you're done after, let's say 1 day of processing. Well, you don't need the other 30 days of it to be 8 CPUs. It now can drop down to 4. And we did that all with scripts automated in the ETL process. The ETL process actually would reach a point into the workflow, run the database, scale it up to like 8 CPUs, run a big batch in parallel, and scale itself back down to 4 as soon as it was done. All automated. And also I talked about, we did the transfers from the autonomous data warehouse side to the AWS S3. And then we went in and configured notifications, alerts, budgeting, cost planning. All of those things are the governance piece that you need to be able to manage it for one, and also make sure you're on track with your budgeting costs. So now I'm going to talk about the things, if you're going to do an Oracle migration, most of the migrations for Oracle Cloud that we've done have not taken these things into consideration. They're things that we discover over all the migrations we've done. And so this is something, we present up front saying you need to address these. So size it based on whatever your concurrency requirements are, not your CPU. So it's very typical that you'll start out with, I have 4 CPUs on-prem. What do I need on the cloud provider? And the cloud provider will assist you with saying, okay, you need only 2 in the cloud, or you may need 6 in the cloud, depending on cloud provider maybe. That's not always the best measurement for the actual usage. You have to understand what these service limits are for different, in this case, the autonomous data warehouses. You need to know what those service limits are, because your requirements for a number of users connecting to your database and concurrently running things could be wildly different than what you would be allowed for a CPU conversion. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. Also, understanding parallel processing. This company did a lot of parallel processing before, but now once you go to ADW, and this really is prevalent for clients that are standard edition migrating to the cloud, they don't have a sense of, hey, I used to run serially before because I couldn't run anything in parallel. Now things run in parallel automatically, and now I could get these Oracle errors. So there could be some changes in your code or changes in the process, depending on how many CPUs you end up deploying on the autonomous side. Again, I talked about the service limits. You really need to understand these, depending on which autonomous database you pick. How many concurrent for the concurrency piece of it, how many of these can I have running at a time? If you're just a transactional system, then 300 times the number of your OCPUs, or same thing for the ATP side, that's going to be probably fine. Again, you should still make sure you meet your user requirement. But when you talk about things like medium, where things are going to run in parallel, now if you look at this number, 1.26 times the number of CPUs. So if you put a 4 CPU machine out there, you're going to get 5 concurrent processes running at a time. That may not be enough for you. You may have situations where you combine reporting aspects with ETL with an application. Well, you could definitely have more than 5 that you would need to support. So sizing in the beginning is crucial. You'll figure this out, or you should figure it out during your POC. It's common to start with a load number, figure out where your baseline would be, and then use up that POC time to find out where the max is. Now you have a lower and upper range of what you're going to need to scale to in the future to meet those needs. Other things, plan how you're going to use your compartments. This determines how you're going to do all your permissions. There's different ways of doing this. I've seen it done multiple ways. I have a preference, but it depends on your business. Do you base these compartments by environments, or do you base it based on organizational functions or even departments? You could have a research and development department. You may create a compartment just for research and development. Put databases, put servers, apps, compute insight, whatever you need to do in that. And now you can control, as you'll see, you can control budgets, resource quotas and all that for those particular items in that compartment. So think of, you give this some thought, there's no right or wrong, and you can also change it after you've already done it. You can move things around and recreate your compartments without impacting anything, but give it some thought. Also, the big ones you need to know about is character sets. So the migrations we've done, their on-prem character set was not AL32 UTF-8. It was a Western European. It was a Windows character set. You're going to run into issues on migration for that because you're not going to be able to fit that single byte, maximum single byte character string in a multi-byte scenario where you could actually exceed the lengths of your field. So there has to be some work done there to determine that. And Oracle has some scripts to allow you to identify all that up front. The biggest one hits every single client we've done, sysdate and systimestamp. Every database, almost guaranteed, has code somewhere in triggers or in defaults on the column that stamp some column value with the sysdate. And on-prem, you're going to get your on-prem server sysdate timestamp. When you go to the cloud, UTC. So obviously, I mentioned one of the post-migration steps that we had to do is while data was being generated on the cloud, it was generating new values at UTC, but there was lots of other sysdate non-UTC data already in the database. That's a huge problem for reporting or if you're trying to consolidate information. So we did a massive update and just updated them all to UTC at the time of cutover. You're going to have to give this some thought. There are some other ways to replace it with the current date, current timestamp, but you're gonna most likely hit this. Pre-planning, I can't emphasize enough that you need to look at all those third-party applications. This is where I talked about you're going to figure out what assets you have and what other dependencies they have with applications, COTS programs, things like that, to validate whether or not they can even connect to the cloud. We did run into some cases where there's applications that connecting to the on-prem database is just easy as a host port SID. Connecting to the cloud did not support it. There were pieces of the app that would not allow you to put in a service name or would not allow you to specify where our Oracle wallet is. So those kind of things you have to kind of overcome. And we were able to overcome all of them. It was just, like I said, some of the third parties didn't even know how to do it. So reaching out to their support to get guidance, we basically provided the guidance back to them as part of our migration for this client. And that was ETL, that was tool sets being used. So you got to know going into it which one of these applications you're not going to have a problem with and which ones you might have to spend some time on. Post-migration, I just want to kind of wrap this up with the one thing that I've seen across all the migrations as well is you do this POC, you actually even get all the way through the entire migration and you're done, or you shut off everything on-prem and you're running in the cloud. Almost all of them have leftover items of that migration that compromise your security. Things like users still in there that were part of the migration, but they're not part of the business and they don't need to be in there. Policies that were created really broad with maybe access to an entire CIDR block when it really only needed to be one or a couple IPs, and policies about which permissions different things were allowed to modify, manage in the cloud. Those were all left over. And the scariest thing is those are left over from a network security rule and list. So basically your broad networks security groups, and if you have security lists, which are a little bit more fine-grained, those were open to IPs and stuff. Those were done generally just to facilitate really quick getting things to work, or not knowing exactly how you might need to restrict it. Please pay attention to the post-migration cleanup and make sure you get your security posture right as part of that. I think now we can take any questions.
Well, great job, Armin. Thank you so much. So let's see what we have for questions. There's a couple in there. So the first one, is it better to have a single cloud provider or multiple cloud providers?
All right, so the way I'm going to answer that is depends. It might not be the perfect answer you're looking for, but it really does depend. It really, are you going to adopt or be constrained by whatever services that are available by that single provider? That's, you should ask yourself that. I mean, I hear from the clients that they would rather just get a single invoice. They don't want multiple invoices. Well, that's really not a good measure about how you should go about your migration and picking your providers. The goal should be improving the business, maximize your ROI. Most companies' core business is not IT, it's something else. So I would recommend, I generally recommend that when you go through these phases, planning phases, you pick the provider that provides the best functionality at that cost. This generally means you might have multiple providers. An example might be if you're a heavy Oracle shop, well, I mean, it's a no-brainer there. You put that in Oracle side. But if all your applications are written in .NET and your company uses all the Microsoft back office applications, they use Microsoft Azure directory, then in that case, it makes more sense to have Azure and Oracle. There's no drawbacks to that. Let Microsoft handle what it does best, let Oracle do what it does best. Even the more complex scenarios would be where you're replacing on-prem services with a better cloud service. In that case, you should be choosing that provider based on that service that meets your business requirements and your ROI.
Okay. All right. Well, you had mentioned proof of concept quite a few times, and we do have a question about this. So how do you decide what should be included versus trying to test everything?
Okay, so there's kind of two approaches to this. You can take the easy route or the complex route. So what I mean by that is you take the simple approach. If you take that approach, you select the asset has the least amount of dependencies, it's the most self-contained, it's the easiest to map to the cloud, and use that for the POC. The advantage of that is you get a really quick win, you build confidence in your team and the business that your overall migration strategy will be a success. It also allows you to discover some things that could pop up that you would then use to improve your overall migration strategy. So there's value in being able to pick that small one that can carry over. The disadvantage, though, is that you may not address all the things up front. That POC is not going to identify all the things that you're going to have to address if you did a more complex thing. But I think the simpler approach is the one that I would prefer taking. If you decide to do the complex approach, that's where you're going to spend more time up front. You're going to be more time on those assets, identifying dependencies and what are all the moving parts. But you will discover just about everything that requires the most attention. Remember when I talked about those 5 R's, refactor, rebuild, replace, things like that? You're going to discover what all of those pieces, how they're going to be mapped. What is your approach to doing the migration? So the remainder of everything else that you have to migrate should be much easier. So the disadvantage I would say to that is it makes your POC run much longer than what you might anticipate.
Okay, great information there, definitely. Let's see. Oh, looks like we have another one. What are some of the most common obstacles to migrating to the cloud?
I'd say the most common ones are a lack of understanding how it relates to security, or at least that's one of them. The security, everybody's concerned with security. Some have the notion that the data in the cloud is less secure. I could argue that cloud providers have much more resources dedicated to security than most organizations do. So if you look at most of the security breaches that are external, that is, not an internal threat, external threats, they occur with the on-prem organizations. So I tend to believe that the security done right, and especially if you take advantage of, and I can talk specifically about the Oracle side, if you're doing the security zones, zero trust and their cloud, the CloudWatch piece of Oracle, you basically are getting a JSOC, a 24/7 JSOC as your service. Not a whole lot of organizations have that today. So I think on the security side, I'm more on the cloud provider is more secure. And then there's also the idea that you're giving up control. So I would argue that you gain more control by spending more time on the core business functions of your business and not on the management of those assets. Much of the mundane type activities totally eliminated. The staff is now able to improve the business. That's where you want your staff doing. Like I said previously on the slide, IT is not most core competency, or it's not the core of the business for the organization. So get those IT folks doing things that are focused on the business. The cloud does give you some freedom with that. And then another obstacle is, it's worth mentioning. It's more of an obstacle, but it's worth mentioning, and that is lack of upfront planning. If you don't know what you have to where you want to go, then that's going to be a common obstacle for staff to say we can't do this. I think if you get the proper execution of the phases that we discussed earlier, the migration is much smoother. You remove a lot of those obstacles, whether it be physical obstacles like skill sets or stuff, or more just psychological aspects of it.
Oh, great. I definitely agree with you in regards to the fact that a lot of organizations don't feel that they are giving up control, but ultimately some of the clients that we've done migrations with have thanked us profusely for the fact of making their life much easier. So that was a great point that you had in that last one. All right. Okay, so we are at the end of our presentation for today. We did run a little bit longer than our normal ones, but I do thank all of you for staying on and hearing some of the questions and the answers that Armin was able to provide. So if you do want to contact Neovera for a consultation, please give us, send us an email at info@neovera.com, and we will set up a time that is convenient for you, and we'll discuss strategies and next steps, and even just give you a couple of ideas. So after today's presentation, you are going to receive a link to this recording, and you will also receive a downloadable copy of the Oracle migration checklist that Armin put together, as well as some of the case studies that he was mentioning. And these were part of our previous cloud deployment models, so you may already have them, but if not, they are great information. And as always, we appreciate your time, and we will look forward to seeing you on a few of our future webinars. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.